Once again, welcome to the Neath Port Talbot Innovation Exchange Forum, the place where businesses in manufacturing, engineering, IT and innovation can get together to learn about opportunities, funding and collaboration. Thanks to the Community Renewal Fund, we've heard from some great businesses, such as DASA, the Defence and Security Accelerator, working with the MOD. We've heard from the Safety Letterbox Company, Rototherm, Ministry of Furniture, Vortex IoT and the SDW Group. We're sharing the successes, challenges and visions of these companies, a wide range of different companies. And our remit is to encourage growth, upskills and reinforce the economic opportunities. In this podcast, I talked to Jon Maddy. Jon is working with the SWIC, the South Wales Industrial Cluster. It's a group of major industrial companies in the region, stretching from the Pembrokeshire coast to the Severn Bridge along the M4 corridor.
If you look at the whole of industry, and including the power sector in South Wales, we currently emit through all of our everyday processes something like 16 million tonnes a year of CO2 to the atmosphere. It's one of, if not the largest, single area of industrial contribution to CO2 emissions in the UK. So as a result, we've got the most to aim at in that sense.
The cluster also aims to develop the mechanisms and skills to achieve an ambition that includes circular economy innovations, energy efficiency, carbon dioxide avoidance, the hydrogen economy and low carbon power generation.
So it may well be that things that small businesses in the region are doing might need to change as a result of the changes that we're talking about. But we'd love to have that conversation as a cluster, so the South Wales Industrial Cluster supply chain that says, okay, here are some new opportunities that will be emerging. This is how your future business might shape up. And I think that's the sort of conversation that we could have.
So welcome, Jon. Tell us about SWIC.
We formed something called the South Wales Industrial Cluster, which is basically the large energy using and large CO2 emitting industry throughout South Wales, and that's the whole of South Wales. And the idea really being that we have come together with a common cause of trying to reduce carbon emissions, in fact, head towards net zero carbon emissions, and at the same time, maintain competitiveness, increase the impact on the local economy and so on by taking that action. So we've come together because in doing that role of decarbonising and improving the efficiency of resources that we're going to use, we really need to come together. It can't be one organisation alone.
And what sort of work then is happening now within the Neath Port Talbot, South West Wales region?
Yeah, so just to take a step back a little, so we're part of the University of South Wales and have set up the Hydrogen Centre back in 2008 here. And the whole idea really is that we're looking at hydrogen as a means to reduce carbon emissions from transport, from industry, from our whole energy sector. And the idea is that we worked with industry and with government, including Neath Port Talbot Council, right at the outset to set up this centre. And as a result, it's a unique centre in the whole of the UK, really. There's nowhere quite like this that does research, but also has that strong angle on industry-facing, practical demonstration of technologies. So an example of that was that back in 2009, we set up Wales' first hydrogen refuelling station. We've been refueling hydrogen vehicles here ever since that. We're just in the process of, and indeed this is a project with Neath Port Talbot Council, of upgrading that station, improving that station so that we can run more hydrogen vehicles from the centre. That's on the transport side. And then on the industrial side, we've been working with a number of industry partners since we set up the centre back in 2008 to look at ways in which hydrogen might be used to help them reduce the carbon emissions from their businesses. We've got a number of projects with Tata Steel, for example, looking at ways in which we might decarbonise elements of steelmaking. And that is both by capturing hydrogen and CO2 from their processes, but also looking at ways in which hydrogen might be used instead of coal or coke to make steel in the first place.
Let's just take a little step back for those of us that are. So I've heard about hydrogen cars. We've heard that maybe hydrogen is a better and perhaps more efficient way to cut carbon emissions rather than electric, and especially with everything going on, fuel increase and price hikes and all that sort of thing. How does hydrogen work in a vehicle? Because I think we just need to take a little bit of a step.
Even before I get there, I'm going to take issue with the way you framed that question there, because it's not a competition between hydrogen and electricity. Both are needed. We need to approach our route to decarbonisation by embracing both of those technologies. And there's a huge amount of overlap and complementarity between hydrogen on the one hand and electrification on the other. Just to properly answer your question, hydrogen can be burned as a fuel in the same way that we burn petrol or diesel or natural gas. And when you burn hydrogen, there's no carbon emissions from that hydrogen. The product of combustion is water, and that would typically be water vapor. Depending on the engine, you might get some oxides of nitrogen formed if you combust the hydrogen. So as well as combusting, and certainly there are some vehicles that use combustion as the route to create motive power, but the other way, and really something that's a little known fact perhaps about Wales, was that the fuel cell was invented in Wales, and William Grove invented the fuel cell in what's now Swansea Museum, in a little lab that he had there back in 1839. And what the fuel cell does is it electrochemically recombines hydrogen and oxygen. Now that sounds complicated, but essentially what it does is it pulls hydrogen and oxygen back together and creates an electrical power as a result of doing that. That electrical power that can then be used to drive motors in exactly the same way that batteries currently drive battery electric vehicles. So the difference, if we're focusing on differences, is that with a hydrogen vehicle, you can fill the vehicle with hydrogen in the same way that we currently fill with petrol or diesel, and you carry your fuel on board. Whereas with a battery vehicle, you're obviously plugging in and charging the battery. That has to hold the charge. The charge depletes as you use the energy, and then you've got to recharge. Truth is that hydrogen and battery electric really go hand in hand, because in both cases, especially if you're using a fuel cell, then you're using electrical power to drive a motor, to drive the wheels and to drive the vehicle. So actually, in terms of management of the system, the best system probably has a bit of a mix of hydrogen and batteries as well. And so that's why that's why I went to the extent of correcting you at the start, because I just don't see it as an either or. It's a work together and get the best from both.
And I think that's cleared it up for a few people, because I think there is if you're not in the know as to, and there's so much going on about electric cars and the efficiency of them and transport as a whole, and a conversation about transport, it's just really useful to know that they do go hand in hand in that way. But how does that transpire then into industry? So how would you use hydrogen in an industry based?
So if you look at a range of industries, they're currently using, let's say you've got an industry where you've got a furnace in that industry and it's using natural gas to combust, to get the heat. That drives the process that you're looking to do. And the problem with that is, of course, that in combusting natural gas in that furnace, you're giving rise to CO2 emissions. If you can instead use hydrogen at the burner within that furnace, then again, same thing as we talked about with a vehicle. In combusting, your only product is water. You might have some emissions of nitrous oxide or oxides of nitrogen, but the issue there is that it's about your burner control and how you do that. So the benefit in fuel switching from natural gas or some other hydrocarbon to hydrogen is that you remove the CO2 emissions at the point of combustion. That accounts for a range of industry processes. There are a range of industries that have that type of process that are looking to fuel switch. On the other hand, there are a range of, and I mentioned steelmaking as one example. One of the approaches that you can use is you can, instead of using coke to extract iron from iron ore, you can use hydrogen instead, and it reduces the iron ore to iron, and then that iron can be processed to produce steel in a similar way to we currently do it. So in that case, rather than fuel switching, it's feed switching in that case. But again, because there's no carbon, coal and the coke contains carbon. When that's processed in a blast furnace, then that gives rise to a lot of carbon emissions. If you go the way of hydrogen, then again, no CO2 emissions from that process. It all sounds pretty easy, doesn't it? But the problem is that there's quite a lot of new research to be done that addresses product quality, addresses optimization of those processes. I think that's one of the things that we're looking to do with the South Wales Industrial Cluster, is ensure that we can bring the academic expertise from Swansea University, from Cardiff University, and my own university, and others together to support industry, to say, okay, what are the key research challenges in this? How can we try and make an impact that really addresses the decarbonisation of industry as a result?
So you're doing this research, which is a joint research, which I think is fantastic, and it's great for the region that everybody is working towards one common goal. Let's go back then to my question that was probably a little bit premature, because we needed to find out a bit more about how hydrogen works. What then is going to be happening, or is happening within that cluster, within this region?
I guess the key issue really is that hydrogen, or all of the things I've talked about in terms of using hydrogen, whether it's in transport, whether it's in industry, is only any good if you don't add to the carbon in making the hydrogen in the first place. And if you look, South Wales, probably more than any other part of the UK currently, has hydrogen production facilities, a range of hydrogen production facilities, including in East Port Talbot. The challenge with that is that all of those currently are based on hydrocarbon feed. That hydrocarbon feed means that making hydrogen in that case gives you CO2 emissions. So there's two ways of, or at least two ways of approaching that. One is that you can still carry on that process, but capture the carbon dioxide that's emitted. Part of the activity that we're looking at with the South Wales Industrial Cluster is to join forces to capture carbon dioxide emitted from our industrial processes, including hydrogen production. And then there's two ways that you can then handle that. One is you can look at storing that carbon dioxide. In many cases elsewhere in the UK, there are geological formations that mean you can permanently store that CO2. We don't have that in South Wales. Indeed, the whole of the south of the UK doesn't have those geological features. So as a result, what we're looking at from the South Wales Industrial Cluster is shipping, and particularly shipping from our larger ports, so Port Talbot, Milford Haven, and shipping that CO2 so it can be permanently stored in these subsea geological sites. So that's one way. The other way is to say, okay, well, can we actually turn that carbon dioxide into a resource? And if you look at a range of things that we use every day, plastics and so on, they come from a hydrocarbon source currently. A lot of the research that my colleagues, both at the University of South Wales, but also the other universities that I mentioned in the region, are looking at capturing that CO2 from industrial processes and then upgrading that. So using that to produce things like platform chemicals, other fuels. The argument there is that although it doesn't permanently capture the CO2, at least it offsets or reduces the amount of CO2 that we're releasing to the atmosphere. But there's some very significant progress being made on that whole idea of carbon capture and use regionally, particularly here in Port Talbot, and here in Baglan we've got a pilot plant that's looking at that from capture of CO2 and then producing what's called acetate. We can use that acetate as a platform chemical to make a range of different things for everyday use. And similarly, we've got a pilot plant on Tata Steel site that's doing a similar thing.
That sort of forms into my next question, I guess, then about, one of the things we talk a lot about in the Neath Port Talbot Innovation Exchange Forum is about collaboration and joining forces with other businesses. What do you need as a cluster from local businesses that would help in your research and help drive this forward a bit more?
So I think because we're talking about industry, the existing industry supply chain, regionally, a supply chain will have grown up around, for example, the steelworks or other industry. It's about having a conversation with them about how the future looks. So it may well be that things that current small businesses in the region are doing might need to change as a result of the changes that we're talking about. But we'd love to have that conversation as a cluster. So the South Wales Industrial Cluster, more than happy to have that conversation with a supply chain that says, okay, here are some new opportunities that will be emerging. This is how your future business might shape up. And I think that's the sort of conversation that we could have. But I guess it also extends to a range of levels as well. It's about engagement with our schools and colleges as well. It's not as if we're going to have a complete revolution of new things that have never been thought about, but there are some new techniques, new challenges that we need to modify our curricula to ensure that people are learning the right thing and that the workforce for the future are equipped properly in the region. Again, that's part of the activity that we've got within South Wales Industrial Cluster, engaging with education at all levels, obviously covered in terms of the higher education institutions because we're directly engaged, but also working with partner colleges and looking at how we might shape future apprenticeship programs, lifelong learning type programs as well, so that we equip the workforce to accommodate this decarbonisation change.
And is there a large workforce involved in this? I mean, is there, for those people who haven't heard about it and they don't know about how this works, is it more to do with academia in terms of research, or is there, a way to upskill people and to bring people into this environment?
Yeah, ultimately, it's about industrial jobs and high spec jobs, and the greater number will be in that area. We're, I guess, in the foothills, and so as a result of that, then at the moment there are a range of jobs in various aspects of research and development that we in the universities are undertaking. I'm going to shy away from giving you absolute numbers because they are projections at this stage, but a significant number of new jobs will be available and created as a result of this transition, because essentially we're looking at all of our existing industry, modifying, improving, new requirements in terms of changing their processes. So that's both operational jobs within our industries, but also the construction and all of the trade roles that go with installing new equipment, new plants, and so on, as well as those R&D jobs. But all of these are potentially high status, high spec jobs, and we're keen to try and ensure that can be filled by local people.
What does your future, in terms of this cluster, what does the future look like for you, and how long have you got timescales that you're working towards?
Yeah, so exactly. I mean, if you imagine I will put some numbers on this. So if you look at the whole of industry and including the power sector in South Wales, we currently emit through all of our everyday processes something like 16 million tonnes a year of CO2 to the atmosphere. It's one of, if not the largest single area of industrial contribution to CO2 emissions in the UK. So as a result, we've got the most to aim at in that sense. So what we're looking to do at this stage is there's two main projects underway. One is what's called a cluster plan, and that's essentially saying, okay, we've got to chart a path that goes from here until 2040 or the 2040s so that we achieve net zero. So we essentially eliminate 16 million tonnes a year of emissions by the 2040s so that we can get to 2050 and properly be net zero in the region at that stage. So that's our target. But what we're trying to do is plot the steps along the path that lead us to that. And that will start to mean some incremental changes to some of the industries within their fence line, if you like, or within their premises. But it'll start to mean changes in terms of the infrastructure as well. So, for example, a transition to using hydrogen instead of natural gas in some of the piping systems that go to the industry, and ultimately transitioning domestic supply so that goes away from natural gas towards hydrogen as well. Transitioning part of our transport system to hydrogen, so particularly rail, aviation, heavy goods, heavier vehicles, those that are more difficult to simply meet by battery. Those will start to be happening more over the next decade and more. And then the same, what I haven't said, I mentioned carbon capture from hydrogen processes, but what we do here and have done since inception here at the Hydrogen Centre in Baglan is make hydrogen from renewables. And we'll start to see that at scale and a lot more visibly within the region, and a lot more projects that link wind farms or PV to hydrogen production, both for industrial decarbonisation, for transport, and also for balancing the energy system as well. Because as we increase the amount of on and offshore wind, as we increase the amount of PV, if we get to the point that we've got tidal power generation from barrages or lagoons, then in all cases we need some balancing, and hydrogen is one mechanism of doing that balancing as well. So we'll see a number of things, and whereas we were lucky back in 2009 to have Wales' first hydrogen refuelling station, and I could probably argue that Wales has been a little bit slow in getting its second, third and fourth filling stations. They are here now. We'll start to see a little bit more in terms of activity and a little bit more visibility of hydrogen buses on our streets, heavy goods vehicles, particularly councils using heavier vehicles run on hydrogen, and also some of the infrastructural changes that I've mentioned as well.
And I think it's exciting for business, because this is where everyone's got a social responsibility to go from to get to zero in terms of emissions, and to be much more thoughtful and environmentally friendly in the way that they work. So this type of cluster that gives that innovation, that it has gained that momentum, is going to be of interest to lots and lots of different industrial type businesses.
I think that's right. I mean, if I haven't made it clear, it's the mission of the industrial cluster is to go from where we are now to a point of net zero emissions. That's a massive, massive challenge, but it's something that we've all embraced. Obviously, from my side, the academic side, we're trying to work as closely as possible to address those harder to solve problems for industry, but also with a very practical view on making that happen. And this is really at the cutting edge of decarbonisation. We're trying to achieve that for South Wales.
I think it's one of the purposes of these podcasts are to talk about new innovations that are happening in the region that might be of interest to a lot of people, but also to find out about things that perhaps we weren't aware of or we haven't thought of before. And I think that's what's been really interesting about chatting to you. I have learned so much in the last 20 minutes about hydrogen and how it works, but also about how it affects industry, how it goes hand in hand with other things. And at a time when we're really looking at energy and how energy affects everybody, I just think it's really interesting to hear about other forms of energy that go hand in hand with what we already know.
I think that's right. And I think obviously current conditions mean that we've started to focus on energy independence a lot more. And so, when I mentioned the idea of moving towards renewable production of hydrogen, whether it be from renewable electricity, wind, PV, etc., or indeed whether it's from biomass sources. And again, that's part of the research that we've been doing for 20 years or more, looking at how you can take various biomass, even sewage sludge. So we take sewage sludge and we can make hydrogen from that. It's a key part of us moving towards a future energy system that's cleaner, a little bit more independent perhaps, and certainly affordable. That's what we're aiming.
Jon, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have learned a lot as well. I'd just like to thank you very much for your time. Thank you for chatting. And obviously, if anyone wants to learn more, they can go to SWIC, the South Wales Industrial Cluster website, and all the details and everything is on there.
Thanks, Helen. That's great.
My thanks to Jon for our conversation today, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to find out more about the South Wales Industrial Cluster, you can go to their website swic.cymru. And for more information about the Neath Port Talbot Innovation Exchange Forum, then you can contact me, Helen Bowden, helen@fortheregion.org.uk. This podcast series is available through fortheregion.org.uk and through Neath Port Talbot Council.